Hello, good afternoon. Hello, this is Peggy Fisher coming back to you with episode 3 from Family Secrets. It's a Bible series that we created for Netflix, Virginia Romanette and myself, and I'm reading off the episodes as they come. So we're up to episode 3. We left Helen and her bestie in the Oval Office, and the senator from the South had just fallen down and hit the ground with a cacophony of noises. Oops. Okay, that was incorrect. But it's live, so we'll just continue. Episode 3, an autopsy. Oh. Okay, so Ripley, what can go wrong? Episode 3, an autopsy is ordered. A robbery takes place. Chaos ensues. In the office, present day. The president ordered her chief of staff to notify Senator Baldwin's family of his demise and bring them to the White House. The White House doctor was summoned to attend to the body. An autopsy would be necessary. The president then hastily beckoned her closest advisors to join her in formulating a plan to deal with these developments. Helen was included. Consternation consumed Helen. She could not display the emotion she was feeling over the death of her lover for fear of revealing their clandestine relationship. They had been so careful to keep the relationship private, and Helen was mortified at the possibility that the president might somehow know of her affair with the senator. Was she now being included in the meeting only to examine any role she might have played in the senator's death? She felt sick to her stomach, but Helen was positive. No one knew of the affair. Then again, nothing remains completely secret in Washington. Helen had had numerous affairs over the years, and all had been discreet, ended without fanfare and without scandal. Helen was not one to exhibit emotion, favoring physical over emotional contact, and was not one to commit to a long-term relationship. She could thank Tommy for that. Remember Tommy? Helen's focus was exclusively on climbing the Washington ladder. She had hoped her present position in the administration, combined with the fact that she had won the Pulitzer, would be meaningful stepping stones in her advancing. Was that now all in jeopardy? The meeting commenced with Helen sitting next to the White House press secretary, a useless sycophant who kept whimpering, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" The president looked directly at Helen, and her first comment was, "Helen, you knew Senator Baldwin well, did you not?" Here we go. Helen felt her life was ending right here and now. Not one to beat around the bush, Helen answered simply, "Yes." Without further comment, the president directed Helen to write a press release covering what had transpired and prepare an obituary for the family's approval. No mention of the affair, no chastisement for her behavior. Helen practically swooned with relief, but her reprieve was short-lived when the press secretary, coming out of his stupor, vehemently complained that it was his job to write those missives, not a speechwriter, even one of Helen's caliber. The vice president candidate was dead. Washington was in an uproar, and all the man could think of was protecting the pecking order. However, his complaints fell on deaf ears because the meeting had ended and the room had already begun to empty, except for Helen and the press secretary. Hold on to your seats. Helen's blood began to boil. Using more expletives than a drunken sailor in a dive bar brawl, Helen let the press secretary have it. Helen hit the recall button on every mistake she had witnessed the press secretary make, plus some she had just gotten wind of. Helen was determined to write the press release, and if Madam President wanted her to prepare an obituary, then she was going to do that too. And no whiskey-filled, puffed-up, has-been president secretary was going to get in her way. Go, Helen. Minutes into the undressing of the press secretary, Helen felt a light tap on her right shoulder. Irritated by the intrusion, she attempted to shrug off the intruder and proceeded with her lambasting of the press secretary. She was having fun. When Helen felt an unwanted tug on her right shoulder, she abruptly turned around to see Gabby giving her a very reprimanding look, and so she would wound down her tirade. Helen was all too familiar with that look and the lecture that would soon follow. Gabby, being the tenacious reporter that she was, had moved as close to the meeting room as possible, and upon hearing muffled shouting, immediately entered the room the very second the door opened. Helen then gave a quick, glaring look back at the deflated press secretary and set off to write the press release and prepare the obituary. She would worry about appeasing Gabby later. By the time she had left the room, all thoughts of her career-ending affair with the senator were as dead as he was. Now, dashing down the hall at warp speed in her strappy red Milanos, wearing an equally red, perfectly tailored Gucci suit, Helen was quite a sight to behold. But it wasn't the $1,000 shoes or the $5,000 suit, both purchased at a cheap, deep discount at a warehouse sale, that made everyone want to stop and stare at Helen. It was the effortless way in which Helen did anything that everyone found so appealing. The average U.S. woman's height is 5 foot 3.8 inches. Helen stood a slender 5 feet 10 inches tall. With a good pair of heels, she was easily over 6 feet and always stood out in a crowded room. Her mother may have died when Helen was young, and her dad may be a practicing alcoholic, but they did give her great ammunition to succeed in Washington: brains and the perfect body. Helen was curvy, but not too curvy. She had full breasts that were in perfect proportion to her full hips, but both still fit comfortably into her off-the-rack size too. Helen always wore her long hair at a high ponytail, but start all over again. Helen always wore her long hair in a high ponytail, but if she ever did let it down, then her sun-kissed blonde strands fell gracefully into the swell of her back. Helen was a knockout in anybody's book. The only thing more impressive about Helen than her stunning good looks was her IQ. Using a deviation IQ test, the current standard used, where about 2/3 of all test takers attain a score from 85 to 115, and about 5% of the population score above 125. Helen's IQ was 130. Helen was above average in her look. Helen was above average in her intelligence. Except for Gabby, Helen was lone. It's not that Helen was a snob. She was just socially inept. After the preliminary greeting, she would always be at a loss for words. Helen didn't indulge in small talk because she didn't know how. But none of that mattered right now as Helen headed out the door of the White House and headed home to hubby. Gotta take a sip here. This late in the day, Helen would normally commandeer a White House fleet car for her trip home, but today she needed to clear her throat and contemplate how she would phase the press release. So she decided to take a walk home. Even in the heels, it was what she needed. She could stop at the favored bodega for a takeout meal, eat when she got home, and then get down to work. In keeping with the tenor of the day, total disaster, as Helen entered the market, she found the clerk being held at gunpoint, an obvious robbery in process. Being a beautiful woman living in a somewhat crime-laden neighborhood, Helen had wisely taken an extensive self-defense course. Slowly taking off her shoes and quietly removing her pepper spray from her purse, Helen moved in, adroitly sprayed the robber, then plummeted him with one of her spiked heels. Ooch! As the robber dropped to the ground and the clerk was able to restrain him, Helen began to shake, belatedly realizing how much danger she had put herself in. Spike heel versus gun? Not her wisest decision. Could this day get any worse? Yes, Helen had broken the heel on her very expensive shoe, and now she'd have to wait around to give a report to the police. The very grateful clerk offered Helen a cup of the finest bourbon the store carried, and without a second thought, Helen downed it. So much for clearing her head. Luckily, when the police had finished their initial investigation, one of the detectives offered to drive Helen home. Because she was exhausted, Helen repeatedly accepted the offer. She may have been repeating, but she readily accepted the offer. Surprisingly, on the short ride to her studio apartment, Helen had no problem whatever engaging in small talk and actually laughing with the detective. Helen's conclusion for the fluidity in the conversation was that it must have been the bourbon. It wasn't until Helen was tucked safely behind her locked door that she realized she had forgotten to order her dinner. Helen walked apprehensively to the kitchen, looking for something to eat. Upon opening the refrigerator door, Helen wasn't the least bit surprised to see a lot of unused real estate in her refrigerator. A quick survey of the freezer looked just as bleak. Although naturally thin, Helen wasn't a huge eater and even less of a cook. Fortunately for Helen, one thing she had mastered in her life was reading the menu and ordering takeout. Between the unexpected and devastating passing of the senator, the emotionally heated argument with the press secretary, and the violent encounter with the would-be robber, Helen was looking for some comfort food. Frankston beans were Helen's favorite comfort food. One of the few happy memories Helen had with both her parents and her brother was the four of them fussing over how much maple syrup to put in the coveted pot of Frankston beans, a family favorite. But with most of Washington following the plant-based trend, you are hard-pressed to find a can of Frankston beans on the grocery shelves, and certainly not on a takeout menu. Switching gears, Helen decided to go big. La Diplomate, a French bistro, known to locals as a place to go if you are interested in seeing anyone who's ever been on Meet the Press. A loud, bustling space with excellent food service and wine. Inside dining was the greatest, but the restaurant was also the best place to order takeout. She would order with La Diplomate fromage, a selection of cheeses, followed by a burgundy American cheeseburger and pomace fries, French fries, finishing off the meal with a milk chocolate pâte de crème chantilly, Helen's usual order. Helen instructed Siri to call La Diplomate at 1601 14th Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. After someone at the restaurant picked up, she then placed her order. What felt like a lifetime later, the doorman buzzed the intercom of her studio apartment. Fully expecting it to be the restaurant delivering her food, Helen eagerly answered the phone. But it wasn't the doorman. It was the detective that had driven her home, following up to see how she was doing. Startled by the unexpected interruption in her evening, Helen muttered she was fine and abruptly hung up. Without the aid of the bourbon, Helen was at a loss as to what to say to the detective. A disappointed and apparently smitten detective left without further ado, his parting witnessed only by the amused doorman. Ooh. Minutes later, the doorman buzzed Helen's studio apartment again, and this time it was the delivery man from the Diplomat. Much to the relief of Helen's delivery person, and Helen, still full of an abundance of energy from the day's excitement, offered to run down the 4 flights of stairs to retrieve the food. When Helen opened the door to her studio apartment and entered the hall, the aroma from her dinner had made it to the 4th floor. The cheese appetizers she had ordered to complement her favorite Zinfandel, the Federalist, could only be detected by an admirer of the selection, such as Helen. But the cooked medium burger, surrounded by the best fries Washington had to offer, could be detected by anyone. Helen flew down the stairs to grab her dinner, tipped the haggard delivery person a handsome sum for his efforts, and climbed back up the 4 flights of stairs to enjoy her comfort meal. Helen didn't often eat in her apartment, but she did have a well-established routine for when she did. Tucked tightly against the arm of her couch, using the adjacent end table, Helen sat down to enjoy her meal. The first course was a select few bites of each of the premier cheeses, which complemented her choice of wine. Never one to overindulge. It was all about tasting the cheese and the wine, never about getting full on cheese and wine. 4 bites, that was her limit. Then it was on to the main course, Burger American. Immediately upon unwrapping the burger, she grabbed a knife and cut it in half. As hungry as Helen was, it was no excuse to eat an entire burger. Dressed in her oldest pair of ripped sweats and a t-shirt that was 3 sizes too big for her thin frame, Helen opened her mouth wide and bit into the burger Americano with a mouthful of perfectly cooked and seasoned burger and just the tiniest bit of juices trickling down her puckered lips. Helen felt her whole body relax. Mm. Helen liked to eat her food in a manner that allowed her to finish everything at the same time, particularly when it came to her comfort food. The last bite burger, then fries, followed up with a last sip of wine. Dessert would follow later in the evening, if at all. Helen always ordered a dessert, usually chocolate, but rarely ate more than a bite. Helen didn't need to diet to keep her size, 2 frames, because Helen didn't eat much in the first place. The next event planned on her well-oiled routine was a movie. Sweet, but not too sweet. Current because she enjoyed looking at the fashion, and something with a little kick to it, something with a plot that would take her someplace other than her real life for a brief period of time. Helen started channel surfing, looked to find her movie entertainment for the evening when her cell phone rang. The ringtone assigned to the caller ID was the Star Spangled Banner. The White House was calling. Helen's plan for a relaxation before she got down to her assignment writing had just evaporated. The White House Chief of Staff wasted no time on pleasantries. The expedited autopsy had come back on Senator Baldwin, and it revealed that he had died of an overdose of insulin. But Baldwin was not a diabetic. Helen's instructions were to write the press release and obituary without any reference to the cause of death and deliver both to the White House within the next 2 hours. The president was going to be involved in meetings throughout the night, particularly to decide on a new running mate, but also to liaison with the Secret Service in beginning an independent investigation into exactly what had led up to the senator's death. While a formal investigation would be led by the FBI and no doubt included the D.C. Metro Police in the groundwork, the president wanted her own people on the case, hopefully to maintain some discretion and contain what news was provided to the press. In the meantime, Helen was to deliver her work to her nemesis, the White House press secretary, to coordinate distribution to the press. Yes, the day continued to get worse. By the minute, Helen could feel her excellent dinner sit like a ton of bricks on her gut. How and from whom had the senator received the deadly insulin? And where? When? How long after the injection did it take for the insulin to kill the senator? How long had it been between when Helen had said goodbye to the senator and the time he had died? Numb from the phone call, Helen began to clean up. She went to put the remaining cheese, half a burger, and a few stray fries into her vacant refrigerator. With her wine glass loosely held between her fingers of her left hand, she went to reach the refrigerator door. That was the last thing Helen remembered. When Helen woke up on the floor, she woke up to a sea of voices. Evidently, her fall to the ground made quite a noise. I can't even remember what I wrote. Evidently, her fall to the ground made quite a noise in the apartment below. When she fell, the wine glass hit the open radiator and could be heard in the hallway by a passing neighborhood. Helen may not have known her neighbors, but they all knew who she was, and it was only seconds before the apartment manager was summoned to her door and convinced to use his key to gain entrance into her apartment. Chaos ensued when they saw Helen spread out on the floor in front of her open refrigerator, complicated by the red wine spread all over the floor, which they all presumed to be blood. Convinced Helen had been shot, the well-meaning but misguided neighbors, a self-appointed posse, quickly called 911, requesting an ambulance and informing the operator that there had been an attempted murder. By the time Helen was able to sit up, the police and the fire department had arrived, the ambulance had arrived, and so had the enamored detective who just happened to recognize the address when it blared over his radio. Great. Just great. She was not normally one given to exhibiting drama. She prided herself on being a woman in total control. Yet Helen seemed to have suffered a panic attack and was totally unnerved by that development, together with the crowd now gathering in her tiny studio apartment. Helen had a deadline and a very bad headache. The only saving grace was the appearance of her good friend and reporter, Gabby, who had also heard the call on her perpetually present police scanner. Helen needed to get to work, and if she didn't meet her deadline, she was convinced that the White House press secretary would use it as ammunition in his campaign to get her fired. The paramedics were insisting she go to the hospital. The police wanted a detailed statement, and her detective friend wanted to console her, knowing in part what a traumatic day she had had. Helen implored Gabby to convince everyone that she was okay and please leave. After an excruciating hour, everyone was finally gone except Gabby. Helen was now in a quandary as to whether to share what was going on, strictly and completely off the record. And Gabby, or make up, okay. Helen was now in a quandary as to whether to share what was going on, strictly and completely off the record with Gabby, or make up some story to get her friend to leave as well. Gabby may have stood only 5 feet tall, but when she ultimately ordered everyone to leave the premises, no one perceived staying to be an option. In less than a minute, the studio apartment was empty, and it was Gabby at the stove boiling water for a cup of tea. Helen wasn't a tea drinker, but tea is what Gabby drank during times like this, and Helen wasn't going to suggest otherwise. Helen knew was I'm going to turn off the sound. There we go. Helen knew what was coming next. Normally, she dreaded these heart-to-hearts. She was older now and not quite as eager to hear Gabby's input on a given situation, but today was different. Helen was a kid again. She sat anxiously at the edge of the couch, eagerly waiting for Gabby to meticulously finish making her tea. Everything Gabby did was with purpose, and that included making a cup of tea. In what felt like a lifetime later, Gabby brought the 2 cups of perfectly steeped tea over to the couch and sat down facing Helen. It was an odd thought, given the circumstances, but Helen couldn't help taking a moment to observe that even in a crisis, Gabby looked like a consummate professional, and her elaborately coiffed hair and tailored black suit. Gabby took a deep, motherly inhale, looked Helen straight in the eyes, and quietly said, "Start talking." Helen did. As linear and as detailed as she could, Helen caught Gabby up on the last year, starting with the day she was charged with assisting the senator in preparing a speech to the Senate Appropriations Committee, culminating with the dramatic events of today. Gabby sipped her tea and remained expressionless as Helen exhaustively filled her in. When Helen was done talking, she collapsed on the couch in a tsunami of tears. When the tears subsided and she began to feel the relief of heaven, get a little dry. When the tears subsided and she began to feel the relief of a heavy burden having been taken off her shoulders, she looked up at Gabby and smiled. The corner of Gabby's thin lips began to inch upward, where the thinly veiled smile could be seen. Gabby looked Helen straight in the eyes and said, "Are you good?" Helen nodded. "Yes." "Good. Then let's go to work." Contrary to the way Gabby looked, and at odds with what everyone would think, Gabby was a huge fan of crying things out. Gabby believed crying for long periods of time released oxytocins and endogenous opioids, otherwise known as endomorphins. Oh God, I butchered that. These feel-good chemicals can help ease both physical and emotional gains. Once the endorphins are released, your body may go into somewhat of a numb stage. Oxytocins can give you a sense of calm or well-being. And if you were in a pickle, you needed a cool head to get yourself out of it. And Gabby felt her good friend, Helen, had gotten herself into quite a pickle. Helen had exactly 39 minutes left on the White House Chief of Staff's 2-hour mandated deadline to produce the press release and obituary. Yes, Helen was an accomplished Pulitzer Prize writer, but she was also a practitioner. That was not a practitionist, the word is perfectionist. Rushing was not her style, but now she did not have the luxury of time. Did she attempt to negotiate the deadline or turn out what perfection could be done? Gabby came to the rescue, suggesting that since the White House knew Helen's press style, Helen should write the press release, while Gabby would access her news bureau's annals to pull info on the senator and write the obituary. Then each would quickly proofread the other's work and get both submitted. Kind of messed that up. Helen opened Hubby, if you recall, Hubby is Helen's computer, and began to work, but was having a problem concentrating when all she could think about was the senator's death and the highly likely prospect that the senator had been killed. Plus, she had a horrific headache. Gabby noticed Helen's hesitation and barked at her to get back to focus. In spite of the time crunch, the obituary was anything but generic, and even more impressive was the press release. Both were submitted with 2 minutes to spare. The two friends worked well together. Wordlessly, they communicated to each other that they would do everything in their power to find out exactly what had happened to the senator. Both women were convinced Helen's relationship with the senator would certainly now come to light, as would the fact that she had seen him just hours earlier that morning he died. She had not just a career to think of saving, but more importantly, staying out of prison. As Helen's fingers hit the send key, the two women shared a knowing look. It wasn't the first time they had collaborated to keep each other out of harm's way, and they both knew it wouldn't be the last. Now that the deadline was behind them, it was there, and it was time to sit down and do some damage control. Doing damage control was what bonded them. The two women sat down at a tiny 2-seated table by the refrigerator. This time, Helen poured them both a glass of her favorite wine, the Federalist. When they finally said goodnight, it was determined that Gabby would use her news sources to glean anything she could about the FBI and police investigation, and Helen would attempt to get as close as possible to the White House inner circle to determine what they knew. In the interim, it was agreed that Helen should be nice to the enamored detective, and that Gabby and Helen, would meet for dinner the next night at Le Diplomat at 8 p.m. to update each other on what they had learned during the day. And that brings us to the end of episode 3 of Family Secrets by Peggy Fisher and Virginia Romanet. Hope you enjoyed the show. Sorry for all my slip-ups. And again, this is a well-written Bible series. We'd love to submit to Netflix to do as a regular series. We've gone through professionals to get this to look the way it's supposed to look. But we're told the next step is to get an agent. And this is a one-shot wonder, so we're not going to get an agent. So we're going to go the 5 degrees of Kevin Bacon and just send it out there to the universe. It originated, I had paid for Rhonda Rhimes' masterclass on how to write. So I did everything exactly according to the masterclass, and I added one thing that I think was an additional add to the technique, which is I created a focus group after the first 25 pages. So this has already been focus group tested, and it was quite the success. So we just need a little bit of luck sending it out to the universe. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up. As I had mentioned in the very first video, we have 13 chapters to do. And if anybody's thinking of stealing it, go ahead. We've got this locked in 6 ways to Sunday. And if you want to do all the work and create all the millions, we're happy to take a piece of all that. So Peggy Fisher signing off for today. And that's the end of the stream.